Here to welcome you to the third in our 19th annual community lecture series, sponsored by the Alumni Association, of course, as you all know. It's really great to be here this evening. I missed you last week. Somebody said years ago that, I can't remember who it was, who said democracy will never catch on because it takes up too many Thursday evenings. Well, it takes up my Tuesday evenings every once in a while right now. So that's why I had to miss you last week, but I'm really pleased to be back here to introduce Stuart this evening. I'm always supposed to ask you to turn off your cell phone, so if you've forgotten that, make sure you flick those off now. Also to remind you that we're being taped by MCAT and that they will be televising this whole series, and we'll have the schedule for the broadcast by the time the series ends. You can also go later on the Alumni Association website, and you can get that information once it's set. I've been asked to say that somebody found this pair of gloves after last week, I believe it was. Don't run up if they're not your gloves. President Engstrom tried that already, but he didn't really seem to be attached to these gloves. So if they're really your gloves, come on up and get them after the lecture is over, right? All right, so my real job here tonight, and it's a great honor, is to introduce Stuart Hall to you. And as is the case with so many of these people in science series, I don't necessarily run into them very often in the day-to-day on campus. But Stuart and I were just doing a little nobody knows the trouble we've seen, remembering that we were on some awful task force many years ago together. So that's how I know Stuart. Stuart was telling me that he has had a somewhat lighter teaching load early in the semester, so he was able to spend a lot of time working on this lecture, and he had a lot of fun with it and thinks that we could just keep on listening to him lecture for many weeks, and we may decide we want to do that. You remember that I offered a bribe to the first lecturer if he would not say that exercise doesn't matter, because I had just exercised that day. And so I'm hoping that Stuart is going to have some really good news about aging and brain health. So Stuart Hall, I'm going to just ask you to come on over. You all know the format. Stuart will speak, and then we'll have questions and answers, okay? Don't come up and steal the gloves unless they belong to you. Okay, Stuart.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for coming out on such a gloomy night, although I think it's nicer now than it was at 2 or 3 this afternoon. I looked out my window and it was pitch black for some reason. Very strange weather we're having right now. So anyway, I appreciate you coming out, and I want to spend some time talking to you tonight about 2 things. We're going to talk a little bit about what happens with cognition and aging, and then we're going to spend some time about brain health and some of the different things that are out there on that topic. So first of all, I want to give a shout out to my peeps in the psychology department. We have a really excellent department there. We have 10 clinical faculty, 10 experimental faculty, and 3 school psychology faculty. We have about 500 undergraduate majors and about 60 graduate students in various stages of the program. So we have a lot going on there, and it's a top-notch program. I also want to thank my students. They're always sort of my inspiration for my work, and they're making a lot of fun, both my graduate students and undergraduates that work in my lab currently. That's pretty much that list, and many others over the years. And you can tell that it's pretty stressful working in my lab, and my student here, Brooke, is wearing a device to screen alien signals from getting into her head while she tries to work in the lab. And so it's important that we take care of those type of methodological issues. So moving right along. Also just want to take a second to talk about neurosciences, because as we talk about brain, behavior, cognition, aging, those kinds of things, we're really getting into the neurosciences. And I don't think we always have a great sense of what that really means, except it has something to do with the brain. And neurosciences spans this tremendous range from work that's being done at the cellular and molecular level, things like looking at the influence of genes, ion channels in individual cells, what a particular cell in the brain, like a neuron, might be doing, how they work in networks, chemical things that are going on in the brain, like neurotransmitters and other things like that. And so there's that end of the spectrum, but since the brain is also the organ of behavior, then there's another side of neurosciences that's equally important, and that's the examination of the behavioral manifestations of brain activity. And so on the behavioral side, we can look at things like our cognition, our memory, our language, our thinking and reasoning skills, and things like that, as well as behavioral things like are we impulsive or aggressive, withdrawn, depressed, and so forth. And so in that behavioral side is where people like me, clinical neuropsychologists, do our work, sort of doing cognitive examinations. And if I wanted to put in one sentence what it was that I do, it would be that I examine patients who either have or expected of having a neurological condition, and I use a battery of cognitive tests to try and get a sense about where they are on those kinds of measures, and then use that for any variety of reasons, treatment planning, and so forth. And so we need to remember that neurosciences encompasses all these particular aspects. So here's just a very simple illustration. This is looking on the physiological, oh my, I pushed the wrong button. On the physiological side, this thing is very complicated, it has 4 buttons. On the physiological side, looking at differences in EEG patterns to tell us about whether or not we're having slow wave sleep. It's just one of the kind of flavors of sleep that we have. And looking at memory performance, and in this particular study, they looked at memory performance, let people literally sleep on it, and then tested their memory for that the next day. And what we're beginning to find fairly recently is that slow wave sleep is really important for helping us form memories. And when we look at the younger adults, we see that their prefrontal cortex has a much higher level of slow wave sleep activity during a night's worth of sleep than the older adults do. And when you take that into and add it to behavioral data, so you see here's the amount of slow wave sleep on this axis and their performance on a memory test, you see that there's a very tight relationship or correlation between the amount of slow wave sleep and how well they performed on a memory task. And although there's differences between the older subjects and the younger subjects in red, you can see that the correlation was very tight between memory and slow wave sleep. In fact, the correlation was 0.81, which is a very, very strong correlation. This is a quick example of how you might use physiological data, pair it with behavioral data, like a memory test, and get a more complete picture of what's going on. And so that's an easy version. Now, one of the things that we can do now is that we can image the brain and get very clear pictures of pathology and injuries to the brain. And that can be very useful. Obviously, for this individual, you can see there's a lesion here and at another level in the brain here. But what does that mean for this person? What kind of problems is this person going to have? Now, I could look at that, estimate where it is in the brain, and make a reasonable guess about what sort of behavioral consequences that's going to have. But until I actually go in and measure it, I don't really know for sure. You don't always get the same thing. And so one of the things that's really important about neuropsychology is that we're able to put a face on these lesions. We can tell you, yes, your memory's been affected and it's been modestly affected or it's been severely affected. And we can do those kinds of things. And so there's one thing about, you know, the physiology and the brain pictures and so forth, but unless you pair that with the behavioral information, you don't get a very complete picture. And so that's why it's good to have both of those things going for you. And with that said, I thought I'd show you a couple of things. We have scanners now that can give us beautiful images of the brain where we can see the anatomy of the brain. We can see things like this. This is called a diffusion tensor imaging sequence where we're looking at the pathways that connect the different cells in the brain. We can actually trace those pathways and see where they're going. It's really the white matter pathways in the brain, and see how they're making contact at different locations. We also have very sophisticated programs where we can trace the morphology of structures in the brain, see how they change in disease states and things like that. And we're actually beginning to be able to kind of combine these things to see functional systems in the brain, some very sort of rudimentary functional systems like a default system that probably is a major player in, say, maintaining attention or something like that. So we're beginning to make some of these things come together. This is all done with an MRI scanner. And one thing I wanted to point out tonight is that if you're looking for something that's going to really change our life around here, help us get a 3T scanner dedicated for research. We have got everything we need. We've got researchers at the cellular and molecular level and at the behavioral level that are doing that work. We really already have research projects ongoing that could be translated to an MRI scanner almost immediately. We have a new undergraduate neuroscience major that's attracting a large number of majors in only 2 years of being up now. And so everything's sitting there waiting. All we need is that scanner. And it's really not that expensive when you compare it to some of the building projects and other things that go on around here. So no, it's not going to be like your Sonicare toothbrush, but it will actually change things in a big way around here. It would really put on the map in terms of our neurosciences. We already have a fantastic neuroscience program. This would allow us to do state-of-the-art work, and we're sort of chomping at the bit for one of these. Okay, so let's get into the cognition and aging part of this. I thought I'd take this magazine clip from the noted neuroscientist and comedian Steve Martin, and starts off by saying something like this. And being of the less than youthful group, I'm going to get out my glasses so I can read this. And I think I can do it anyway. It says, bored? Here's a way the over 50 crowd can really kill a good half hour. 1, place your car keys in your right hand. 2, with your left hand, call a friend and confirm a lunch or dinner date. 3, hang up the phone. 4, now find your car keys. Okay? Sound familiar? It goes on and on from there, and if you like that, you might want to look that up. But this is kind of our sort of captures our sense of aging and cognition in a few sentences. As we move into this, I just want to make the point that what we're talking about is something extremely complex. The brain has been called by many folks the single most complex piece of matter in the universe. Okay, we've actually been able to very accurately estimate this, about 86 billion neurons. Now, neurons are the cells that kind of do the communicating and transferring of information in the brain, but there's other cells too, like glial cells, that are in there as well. But we have 86 billion neurons, and any one of those neurons can make 1,000 or thousands of synapses on other neurons, influencing their activity, so that you have anywhere from 100 to 1,000 trillion synapses influencing activity in the brain. So if anybody tells you that we know what's going on here, don't believe them. Okay? We know just enough to be dangerous, and we're still pretty much in the dark ages. As much as we know about the brain, we still have a long way to go. So just sort of set the stage in terms of the fact that this is really a complicated thing that we're trying to do. All right. Now with that said, in normal aging, there's a variety of things that go on that we're pretty well aware of. We know that there have changes in our sensory system. Just a moment ago, I couldn't read because my eyesight's not as good as it used to be. So our vision changes, our hearing changes. Not mine, my wife doesn't yell loud enough at me most of the time, but generally that's going to happen. Motor changes, over time there'll be some declines in motor behavior. In the brain there's a loss of neurons over the time. You may not know that your peak volume of your brain was when you were around age 20. And you've been on the downhill slide ever since. So unless you're younger than 20, so be it. Okay. And then cognition, there's declines in some areas of cognition, although other areas of cognition are relatively preserved. And so I want to make that point in just a moment. But even though we have some loss of neurons in the brain and some of our cognitive function is on the decline a little bit, they really shouldn't produce practical significance in terms of changes in our lives. It should be things that are going to make us unable to live by ourselves or things like that. And so these, they're changes, but they're not horrifically dramatic. Now, just to make a point, I've got a couple of these, so don't worry, don't even look at it if you don't want to. But just want to make a point. If you look at this total brain volume, and then here's over age, you see that your total brain volume is maxing out around 20 years of age, and then you're on that downward slide, as I was just mentioning a moment ago. If you want to look at it a little bit more, you can look over here at gray matter. That would be neurons. And if you look at the neurons in your brain over age, you can see that that's peaking out somewhere back before you really expected it to, right? And you've been on the downhill slide since about age 6 or 8 years old. Now, white matter doesn't quite do that. It stays about the same, and that helps us make some compensatory responses to that, because as you're going to see, even though our number of neurons is declining, many of our cognitive functions are continuing to gain during this time. And so we have this landscape of a changing brain, but the question for us tonight is, how does that affect cognition? Oh, then we have people called superagers. Okay, they're also known as curve wreckers in other settings, but you have these superagers, and the thing about them is that you can take these folks that are between 60 and 80 years old, and they're performing on memory tasks as well as 20 to 30-year-olds. And so the question has always been, what's going on with these folks? And when we take a look, what we actually see is that they have a thicker cortex in certain areas that subserve both attention and memory and executive functions. And in fact, in some cases, the cortex of a 75-year-old superager will be the same as that of a 20-year-old. Okay, so they just don't seem to have that kind of neuronal decline. We don't know if they had more to begin with or how they get to this point. But the thing that's driving that superager is the fact that they're maintaining the integrity and the thickness of their cortex as they go into advanced aging. Okay, well, and this is the graph that shows that. I'll spare you that. But the rest of us who aren't superagers are worried about aging. We're wondering what's going on. We want to know how can we age in a healthy way and what sort of things promote healthy aging. But we're also really worried about dementia. We're worried about Alzheimer's dementia, which is the leading cause of dementia. We're worried about vascular dementia, which is the second leading cause, and then other types of disease states that cause dementia. And we're pretty worried about that. We're going to take a look at that in a second. A fun fact, while I was looking through some of this information, I was pretty shocked to see that in 1900, the average life expectancy was 48 years. And now in 2007, for this article that I found, life expectancy is about 75 if you're male or 80 if you're female. And so in just a very short period of time, we are really living to longer and longer periods, and amongst other things, our brains probably aren't quite ready for that. Along with that is that the percentage of older adults is increasing as well. And so just to take a quick look at that, here's a graph. This is for the global population, and you see here we are somewhere right in here, 2016 at about 8 million or so. And you see by 2050, I believe is that date, by 2050 we're going to go up to almost 16 million. It's going to double in that period of time. Now this bottom graph is the number of individuals over age 65 that are projected to have Alzheimer's disease. And if you look at that, again, here we are around 2017, roughly around 5 million. By 2050, that's going to be 13.8 million. Okay, so aging is on the rise. It's a reality. It's inevitable. It's coming. And so one of the things that we need to do is be ready for that as a society. I want to tell you about an experience that I had. It was one of the very first things I did as a young professor when I first came to this university. It's like, I need to get some research going. And so I thought, I'm going to do an older adult normative study. I had some tests that had never been tried out on older individuals. I thought they'd be really good for them. And so I recruited a group of older folks, and we ran them through our tests. You can see up there, they're on average 75 years of age. The range was 60 to 92 years of age. And when we examined these folks with our cognitive tests, one of the things that we saw was that on average, we sort of used an estimate of their cognitive ability, sort of like an IQ, overall IQ score. I like to call it mental horsepower myself because I don't care much for IQ scores. But in particular, mental horsepower, they're at about the 91st percentile on average for age. And when we did this study, in part of the debriefing, they were allowed to call me if they had any questions afterwards. And many more of the participants called me than I expected. And do you want to know almost to a T what each one of those persons asked me? Why don't you know how to use this thing? No? They asked me, do I have dementia? And I was flabbergasted. I usually responded, no, I'm just glad you're not applying for my job, because these folks were really, really doing great. But it really underscored to me how concerned people are, even when they're functioning great as they reach older age, about what's going on with them, and are they going to have dementia, and all these sort of things. And so we're going to get to some of these topics a little bit further down the road. Now, one thing that I want to make the point is that all cognition is not the same. We can divide cognition and slice it up into all sorts of different ways. But one really easy way to do it is to talk about cognitive abilities that are crystallized. Those are things that are like overlearned, really well practiced, super familiar things that you do, and they kind of get crystallized in your head. And then another way of looking at cognition would be to look at fluid cognition. That'd be sort of thinking on your feet, trying to reason and solve problems, have flexibility with your mentation and things like that. And crystallized cognition is more resistant to the effects of aging and actually the effects of all sorts of neurological disease. Whereas fluid cognition is more susceptible to the effects of aging and more susceptible to the effects of a lot of different types of neurological disorders. And so not all aspects of cognition are really at risk in aging. So I want to show you a couple examples of that. This is verbal ability across age groups. I kind of made poor slides for this, so I'll have to explain this. Here are age groups right here, and I'll admit to you that I skipped every other age group, so there wouldn't be a zillion points up here. but the lines stay exactly the same. So here's age along this axis, and then this is their raw score underneath it on this particular verbal ability test. So that's what those numbers are. And when you look at it, you see that 16-year-olds are about right here with a raw score of 30. You see their verbal ability continues to increase until they're somewhere around the 45 to 55 year age. Remember, neurons have been going down for a long time, but verbal ability continues to increase until about this point in time. Then we see some slight decreases, but if you look at the numbers, even the 85 to 90-year-old group is getting a raw score of 33, which is identical to the 20 to 24-year-old group. And so some verbal skills are really quite resistant to the effects of aging, and as I mentioned, also to other kinds of neurological disease. So that's good news. Take it a little bit further. Here's verbal reasoning. So you're using kind of verbal problem solving. Not quite a fluid skill, but a little bit more challenging in that way. And what you see is, again, it's pretty flat out here till about 45, 55 years of age. And then we start getting a kind of continuous decline. But again, if you look at the numbers, the 75 to 79-year-old group is 22.5. That's not that much different than the younger group, and drops down a little bit in the 85 to 90-year-old group. This is what I mean by there's going to be some declines in aging, but they shouldn't be the kind of thing that would really impact your life in a huge way. Now let's look at some more fluid types of cognitive abilities that are a little bit more susceptible to aging effects. So here's a working memory and attention measure. And again, now you see more of a kind of a flat line through adulthood, although somewhere between 30 and 45 we begin to start declining. In our 50s it's declined a bit and continues to go on so until advanced aging, 85, 90 years old. And if you look at the raw scores, you see we're starting out with 9s, which is pretty consistent across the first age groups, and then it drops down, and we're getting into 8, which is not really hardly any different at 65 to 69, 7, and then 6. So there's a slight decline, but it's not gigantic. And again, that's the kind of decline we oftentimes see with aging. For visual spatial reasoning, we see a little bit more dramatic of a decline on this particular measure. The scores that I took on this test are performance is timed. And I'm going to show you in, I think, the next slide about speed of processing. One of the things that definitely happens with aging is speed of processing slows down a little bit. And so some of the decline that you're seeing here is because folks weren't able to finish the reasoning task in the allotted amount of time. If you actually change the administration of the test and give them more time, older individuals start scoring better on that. So you can see that around 30 to 35 years of age, it stays pretty flat, then it begins a pretty steady decline over age until advanced aging, and you can see the scores have changed from a raw score of 46 to 22. So that's a fairly significant decline. And then here's processing speed. And again, you see it pretty stable out through early adulthood and then kind of declining over time until you get into advanced aging. And again, from a raw score of 73, pretty consistent in early adulthood, down to 34 here at advanced aging. So processing speed is definitely one of the things that gets affected with aging. Verbal memory, okay? Not too bad, stays pretty flat out until the mid-50s, and then it starts to decline over time, coming down. This is a different set of data, so the age ranges are different than the earlier slides I showed you. But you can see that, again, that there's this decline that kicks in. I'm 57, so I'm about right here, okay? So just cut me a little slack tonight, okay? I'm on that downhill slide. So, but that's what we see with verbal memory. So you can see there's some things that we're able to retain over aging, and some things slip off a little bit. But again, it should be nothing that would be horrific for you. Now I wanted to show you this because I think it's kind of a cool thing. It'll also speak to some stuff we're going to do a little bit later. This is one of those crystallized functions, vocabulary, sort of verbal ability like I showed you earlier. And you can see that these are years, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, years prior to a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. So they're actually examining this person. They were in a control group in a study. Then the person converted into Alzheimer's disease, so they went back and looked at their data. And when they did, this is what they found, is that those crystallized kinds of cognitive abilities, too many buttons, okay, stay pretty flat for this person. They drop a little bit over time. But look at when you compare that to verbal memory. Certainly around 4 or 3 years prior to the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, it's pretty obvious from cognitive testing that something's going on here. And so I'll show you some things a little bit later that we're doing with neuroimaging to try and identify these disease states before they become clinical, before they're obvious. And that's an important thing. But I'd also like to make the argument that cognitive testing and neuropsychological evaluation is really good at picking up on some of these things as well. And it's probably between the combined efforts of those two that we're going to make really good progress. I'll show you some more of this a little bit later. Now another thing, when you're thinking about cognition and aging and how to do healthy aging and things like that, is to think of all the things that have nothing to do with your brain necessarily. We could have an argument about that, but let's just say these are non-neurological factors. And you could say, okay, depression, that's because there's something in the brain that's gotten altered and so forth, but we don't know what that is right now, and so I'm calling it a non-neurological factor. There's a number of these. So emotional states like depression and anxiety, if you're not getting good sleep, if you're in pain, if you have medical conditions, for example, like diabetes that need to be under better control, if you have medication effects that could be impacting your cognition, if you get fatigued easily, that affects your cognition. And then there's ageism and expectations, which I'm going to talk a little bit about in a moment. But all of these things are treatable. You can do something about these things, and they all have a very significant impact on cognitive function, both for young people and older people. And so if you're worried that your cognition is not right or not as good as it should be, the first line of defense is to go in and look at the things that are easily treatable, things that can be addressed without having to tinker around with your brain at all, and maximize those things. That's going to be particularly helpful. That'd be the first thing that I would tell somebody who came in with that kind of question. I wanted to show you this because I thought this was really dramatic as I was looking through the data for this about sleep. A few of my students are here and they know I'm a real nut about sleep. And this study is really dramatic. What they showed, this is just one night of not getting enough sleep, mind you. It's not a sleep deprivation. One night, if you only sleep 4 or 5 hours, and you normally sleep 7, your risk of getting into a motor vehicle accident is about the same as somebody who's driving with a blood alcohol level equal or slightly above the legal limit, if you only get 4 to 5 hours of sleep. If you get, so there's that one right there, 4 to 5 hours of sleep. There's your odds ratio being in a motor vehicle accident. You see it going up. If you get less than 4 hours, look at that. And that's just one night of not having good sleep. I've had many patients come into my office and I ask them, how are you sleeping? When's the last time you had a restful night of sleep? And they might say, I can't remember when I've last had a restful night of sleep. A year. I've had patients say 5 years or 8 years. Can you imagine? And then you're wondering about why your cognitive function isn't right. We know that, I showed you a little bit earlier, that sleep's necessary for memory formation, but it also fairly recently was shown that you need sleep to sort of clear out the metabolic byproducts of the activity of neurons. It's kind of like scrubbing out your brain, and it really gets it ready to have another day of being active. And so sleep's a very, very important behavior, one that I think is pretty undervalued in society right now. Okay, expectations. I want to take a little time to tell you about this study. This was actually a very complicated study. I pulled out the most simple and dramatic part of it to show you what happens. But this is about those expectations that you bring into a situation. In this case, expectations about aging. And in this study, they took 90 individuals who were 60 years of age or older. They're living independently, so they're doing just fine. And they separated them into two groups. One of them each group got an implicit priming. And implicit priming means that you get exposed to something, and it actually can affect the way you behave, but you're not aware of it. And I'll show you a little bit more about that in a moment. Some of them got primes that were either negative in terms of aging or positive in terms of aging. And then they tested them on their memory performance both before and after that priming experience. Okay, so what they did is they flashed these words on the screen. For most of us, you'd have to flash on the screen for about 55 milliseconds. If you did that, you'd experience kind of a flash on the screen. You'd see something flash, but you'd not be able to see the word at all. You'd have no idea what that word is. Now, for these older individuals, they would have to adjust that a little bit. So some of them did it at 55 milliseconds, some of them did it at 65 milliseconds, and some of them had to adjust it up to 112 milliseconds before they would just see a flash. So that's all they're seeing is a flash. Some of them got negative primes about aging, sort of senility themes, Alzheimer's, decline, dependent, senile, misplaces, dementia, dying, forgets, confused, decrepit, incompetent, diseased. Those are the things that are flashing up in the screen. The other group got positive stereotypes about aging. Things like guidance, wise, alert, sage, accomplished, learned, improving, advised, creative, enlightened, insightful, astute. So this is what they're happening to them. They have no awareness of this. By the way, these words have never appeared on a faculty evaluation of me yet. So anyway, here's what they found. I boiled this down kind of to the nutshell. But they took, the memory test both before and after that implicit priming task. And what they found is that immediate recall prior to the negative senility primes, they scored like this. Afterwards, their memory performance actually went down. On every measure of memory, as another, I won't go into what the different qualities are, just take my word for it that these are different aspects from a memory test. They went down, delayed recall went down, and photo recall, whoops, missed that one. I was playing with my slides earlier, sorry. Kind of didn't change too much. For folks who got the wisdom prime, actually went up in the post-test. And up a little bit, this is significantly higher. So they all went up, some of them significantly higher. So the bottom line is that, first of all, you can have these negative or positive stereotypes about aging inside of you without your awareness. They're just there from your experience and things that are happening to you. And if I said, oh, you're being negative about aging, you'd probably say, no, I'm real positive about it. But you don't know. These things are inside of you. They're outside of your awareness. So that can happen, but also that negative stereotypes have that negative effect on your performance. And actually the positive stereotypes about aging had a positive effect on their cognitive performance. And I saw this actually as well when I was a very new professor here, and it really blew me out of the water because I was a clinical neuropsychologist and I used this cognitive testing to find out what was going on with people. And here's this thing, stereotypes and what people buy into them, that can significantly affect how they do on these kind of measures. And so this was a real wake-up call. And this has been extensively studied in other areas of psychology like social psychology. There's a whole literature on stereotype threat, and how it impacts people. So I'm well out of my depth on this, but I thought it was something that's really important to bring up. There's also ageism. And we've, just to summarize some of the research on ageism, when older people believe in negative stereotypes about aging, their memory is negatively affected, their will to live is affected, they're less interested in engaging in healthy behaviors, their recovery from illness is affected, their cardiovascular reactivity to stress is increased, and their longevity is decreased. And so buying into these negative stereotypes and negative messages about aging has significant consequences for us. I felt a little uncomfortable, so I actually quoted the person that said this rather than myself, but it says, ageism remains one of the most institutionalized forms of prejudice in American culture today. And of course, having looked around at current events, I'd have to say we still have a long way to go in terms of racism, sexism, sexual minorities, etc. We've got still a lot of work to do. But I do think that ageism isn't out there as much as maybe it should be. And there is a lot going on there. And so in this article, this author really encouraged people, based on that literature review that I showed you a moment ago, to really embrace the positive ideas about aging. We need to get society on board as well. Our society has very negative notions about aging, and we need to try and turn that around, that aging is a time for growth and enjoyment of life. Positive family relationships and social support systems are really important for us to be able to do this. And we also really need to educate healthcare professionals, because there's actually a lot of, they carry a lot of negative stereotypes about aging as well. And so we need to get folks on board with this across sort of multiple levels of society. Another thing that comes into play that makes us, as we get older, feel a little dicey about our cognition is the good old days bias. And the good old days bias is basically, if you take somebody and say, like someone like me, 57, and say, how were you back when you were 20? Boy, I was good back then. Leap over tall buildings and a variety of different things. But if someone has a negative event, like I mentioned a back injury or a traumatic brain injury or something like that, then when they look back, it's even better back in the old days, right? And so a negative experience can really make you look back and you feel like, look at me now, I'm having trouble, my back's injured, and boy, when I was 20, I could lift 1,000 pounds, and it really gets amplified, and it makes us feel bad when we look back and say, I used to be able to be this way, and now I'm this way. So that good old days bias is something that affects us. And I think that advanced aging is something in our society we experience as a negative event. It makes us look back and think, I've really changed a lot. And that's a bias in our thinking because of the way that we think about aging. And so that's another player that we need to be mindful of and be taking account of. The other thing is we just need to give ourselves a break, right? Okay. There are things that we all forget, whether we're old, young, or in between. Like telephone numbers. Okay, I color-coded this so that you could see these are two different studies. The commonality, telephone numbers. People's names. Where did I park the damn car? Here's the car parked. Where are your keys? Forgot to get groceries? Yep, forgot to get groceries. Why did I enter this room anyway? Many of you may be thinking that right now, but in other circumstances, why did you go into the room? And then there's some sort of ones that are a little bit idiosyncratic to each of the studies. And again, I've sat in my office and had patients come in and they've said, you know what, Dr. Hall? I went into your room and I couldn't remember why I went in there. I'm like, yeah, I did that too. But they're telling me this as if, look at how damaged I am from something like, say, a traumatic brain injury or something. And then I forgot my car keys. I'm like, yeah, me too. And so one of the things that we need to recognize is that we all make mistakes. Our memory have failures all the time. We're busy. And these things are just common mistakes that we made. These are not signs of neurological disaster, okay? All right, now let's switch over to more talking about brain health now that we've got some of these ideas about cognition and some of the other things that affect our perceptions of our cognition as we age. Brain health, there's a lot of confusing and contradictory information out there, and the literature is just really not that well developed, and so that's one of the realities of it. There's a lot of really cool stuff, especially from the basic neurosciences like neuroplasticity, which we've actually known about for a long, long time. 70 years, 100 years, just depends on how you want to count. But now it's marketable, and so suddenly we're talking a lot about it. Neurogenesis is a more recent thing. We can actually grow new brain cells in certain areas. That's a dogma that we used to believe that didn't happen. So that gives us more hope about that. So what are some of the things that we can do now to try and promote healthy aging and brain health as we grow into older years? Well, first of all, like I said before, you really want to address these non-neurological factors because they are addressable. And these are things that can have a very significant negative impact on your cognitive function. And for each one of these things, I could have cited 3 or 4 or many studies that have demonstrated this. But again, mood states like depression and anxiety, stress, sleep, pain, medical conditions, medications, fatigue, and then what we just talked about, expectations about aging and our buy-in to negative stereotypes about aging. So first thing that I would suggest is look around and see if any of those things are at play for the situation, because those are things that we can really deal with. Also, physical activity and exercise has been shown to be beneficial for cognition as we age. It improves cognition. It also improves cardiovascular health. And as you know, heart disease is a big problem in our country. Vascular dementia is the second leading cause of dementia, and certainly Alzheimer's disease coexists with vascular dementia. And any time that your brain is not getting the blood flow that it needs, it's going to be problematic. Your brain uses about 1/4 of your total body's metabolism, and it needs glucose and it needs oxygen from your blood supply in order to make your neurons function normally. So anything that's perfusing blood up into the brain is going to be good for it, and things that get in the way of it, like atherosclerotic plaque building up in our arteries and things from eating high-fat diets and so forth, is going to be negative. But some other things about exercise is that it keeps you engaged. You're out doing something, and that's what you're going to see is a big part of it too. You just need to stay engaged with life. If you're out there doing things, you're going to be interacting with people, talking to people, exposed to new things, and that's good for your brain as well. And finally, exercise has a significant antidepressant effect. There's a lot of studies now that show that exercise can help people who have depression as much as antidepressant medications can. And so this is really, you can't lose. This is a good thing to do. So exercise and physical activity. Also, you might be in a situation where certain lifestyle modifications would be useful for you. So I just found this quote: a 25% reduction in midlife diabetes, obesity, hypertension, and physical and cognitive inactivity could potentially prevent 500,000 cases of dementia in the U.S., saving $25 billion annually. Okay, so that's pretty dramatic. And that also gives you a sense of what kind of dollars we're talking about as our aging population continues to grow. But just some lifestyle adjustments may really have a big impact on this. There are some studies that show that meditation can be helpful for cognition and aging. There's not a lot of those, but there's different types of meditation where you're really very, very focused attention versus what they call open attention, like a mindfulness practice. Those have been shown to be helpful, so that's something to think about. I saw this, I thought it was kind of cool. Tai Chi. for a certain cognitive skill, executive function. And basically, on the way to look at this graph is if it's going in this direction, the studies favor Tai Chi. And if it's going in this side of the line, they favor control groups. And this is a meta-analysis. In other words, they took a whole bunch of different studies that had looked at this and combined their data to get a more powerful look at the phenomenon. And what you see is that for executive function, practicing Tai Chi versus a control group, all the lines are in the direction of favoring Tai Chi. For executive function versus active comparison, so they're not just a do-nothing control group, they're active, in this case walking, again, in the direction of Tai Chi. And then taking another quick look at this global cognition, Tai Chi versus control, again lining up in favor of Tai Chi. And global cognition, Tai Chi versus active comparison, so the control group was doing some sort of activity. Again, most of these, this error bar is getting over on this side, but most of these, again, lining up on the side in favor of Tai Chi. And what I thought about this is with all the brain health things that are going on, it was just interesting to me that you could do something as simple as participate in Tai Chi. It's simple, it's inexpensive, and so forth. And it may actually have some beneficial effect. So I thought that study was interesting. You probably heard about diet. The Mediterranean diet is the one that has been most well studied, which is not very much. But there are some studies out there about Mediterranean diets and other just basically healthy diets have been shown to really have an improvement in cognitive function. And so diets that emphasize vegetables, fruits, and fish, nuts, soil products, and moderate alcohol, okay? So that's good. I can do that diet. Moderate alcohol. The less healthy diets are red meat, deep fried foods, and sweets. Oh. Well, cognition isn't everything. Okay. Speaking of nutrition and nutritional supplements, how many of you have heard of Prevagen? Okay, well, I had to look up Prevagen to see what was going on with it. Here's what the Prevagen people say. In a computer-assessed, double-blind, placebo-controlled study. Now, for those of you that are scientifically minded, you know that's the gold standard type of research design. Double-blind, placebo-controlled, randomized study. Prevagen improved recall, task, in subjects. And boy, look at them go. They're just shooting right up there. The only problem is they don't tell us anything about what this axis is. And what they failed to report are two things. One kind of minor but troublesome is that this study was conducted by the Prevagen people themselves. And secondly, they don't report the data for the control group, who actually did as well or better than the Prevagen group. Now, the New York Attorney General was not too impressed, and he basically said this marketing is a clear-cut fraud from the label on the bottle to the ads airing across the country, and really let them have it. And here's one of the punchlines that I think is a good takeaway message for tonight's talk is that not only are they targeting vulnerable populations, but advertising a product that costs more than a week's worth of groceries but provides no health benefits. And I think that that's really where the rubber meets the road with this stuff is there's different things you can do, but is it worth paying $200 a week for one versus something you can almost do for free on the other hand? I think that's where we are with this topic right now. There are things that you can do, but is it worth it? Okay, and so as a result, New York State and the Federal Trade Commission is charging the marketers of Prevagen with making deceptive memory and cognitive improvement claims. So I'm sorry for anybody taking Prevagen out there. I figure I'm going to ruffle some feathers and didn't see anybody spit pills out. So I think we're okay so far. Okay. We've sort of hit on this, but I wanted to underscore it again. Social engagement and mental stimulation is really important as you age. If you think about these things that we try and do to improve the health of our brain, we're trying to make our brains active and do things. Well, that's what living life is all about, right? You get out, you go out and you see someone and you have a conversation and you exchange ideas and you smell the fresh air and you hear things and your brain's built to do that. And so really being engaged in life is about as powerful a thing as you can do. And so being engaged, whether that's family, friends, and the community, mental stimulation, get involved in hobbies, crafts, other things like that. I like to ride my mountain bike, so I had to put this on here. Never underestimate an old man with a mountain bike. And then I've also started curling, so I had to put that up there too. But that's keeping me pretty busy. But these are all things that are not just suggestions. These are things that have research backing that show that they are important components of having healthy aging. Okay, now what about these brain training programs that we're hearing about? Now what's going on with those? And I'd have to say, first of all, that the jury is still out on some of those. But there's a problem with these programs, and that is there's a huge potential for conflict of interest. This is going to be super lucrative. This is a really, really big business. Oops. We're talking about, in 2005, folks made about $100 million doing this kind of work. Around now, they're expected to be over in the billions of dollars that people are making in this business. When you have conflicts of interest, you tend to do bad things like you don't talk about the findings that don't work so well, you make interpretations that don't really fit your data, you ignore small effects. And as I was mentioning a moment ago, less costly treatments get ignored. And I think that's a big problem there. I wanted to really show you a couple of studies. I'm running tight on time, so I'm going to still try and convey the information, but move with a little bit of pace. This is one study that's pretty well known in the brain training literature, the ACTIVE study, where they looked at people, community dwelling adults, out for 10 years after this brain training intervention to see how they were doing. And they had 3 groups. One group got memory training only, one group got reasoning training only, one group got speed of processing training only, and another group was a non-contact control group. And their intervention, they got 10 basically 1-hour sessions over 10 weeks. And then they got booster trainings at 11 and 35 months. And then they measured them over time, immediately 1, 2, 3, 5, and 10 years after the intervention. And so in this study, I'm just going to skip over to this. I know you should never show a graph like this, so I'm just going to walk you through the key points, which is for the memory group, the ones that only got memory training. They looked at them 10 years later. They looked at the effect size, and it's nothing. So 10 years later, the memory group is not showing any benefit from this training. They did at 5, but not at 10 years. For the group that got reasoning-only training, the effect size is small, but still there, some minimal benefit. And for the speed of processing group, the effect size is actually large. It's pretty striking. And quite frankly, I find it really hard to believe that 10 1-hour sessions could lead to anything 10 years later. And so what we really need is more research like this and replication of these kind of findings. But people that are into the brain training game will point to this study and say, well, have you seen that? And so it is out there. It's a good study, but we need to see replication of this before we could buy into it. The other things I wanted to point is that on other measures of activities of daily living, being able to take care of their cooking and cleaning and things like that, if you look at their self-report, their effect sizes are medium. So that seems to have been positively affected and hangs out and holds up over time. But if you look at performance-based things of everyday problem solving, speed of processing, all the effect size are basically non-existent. So that's a problem too when you got self-report data and it's looking really good, and then you actually measure it and it's not looking so good. So there's some things there to think about without going into this. But when you see that study, if it ever comes up, know that you've got to kind of dissect it a little bit before you can make sense of it. what they actually said, I think this is one of the key points, is that they stated that they got all these findings that I just pointed out to you, but they also said that the effects of cognitive training are specific to the trained cognitive ability. So if you look back at that chart, the memory group who got memory training, it only affected their memory performance. And this is 10 years, it doesn't show up. At 5, it did. For the reasoning group, they only got a decent effect size for their reasoning ability, but not for memory or processing speed. And for the processing speed group, they got an effect size for processing speed, but not for reasoning or memory. Okay, so they're saying this effect is specific to whatever it is that you practiced and trained for. This is a study that's another meta-analysis. So they took actually 170 studies and combined them and looked at the data and extracted from them the findings. And they had 3 main points about brain training. There's extensive evidence that brain training tasks improve task performance on the trained task. So if every day you practice a certain type of puzzle, and they said, okay, now it's a test and it's the same kind of puzzle, guess what? You do good on it. There's less evidence that such interventions improve on closely related tasks. And most importantly, little evidence that training enhances performance on distantly related tasks, or that training improves everyday cognitive performance. In other words, these effects that you get with the brain training programs are good if you're doing that brain training program, but they don't generalize to everyday activities in the real world very well. That may vary from person to person, of course, but in general, that's what the overview of 170 studies on this topic showed. Speaking of which, you may have heard of Lumosity. They just got sued last January and are divvying up for making false claims about their brain training program, saying it would sharpen performance in everyday life and protect against cognitive decline. Problem was they'd done no research to show that. So that's something that's a little eye-catching. You say, well, we hear about these products all the time. Well, let's move on from there. Now, I wanted to finish up. There are other types of work being done that may incorporate brain training approaches that really seem to have a lot more going for them. I think this is a really cool example. This is a study that's going on at the Mayo Clinic. And they're looking at folks age 50 and older. They're still collecting data on it right now. But you're not just getting one thing. Remember I started saying, life, you go out and there's all sorts of things that are coming at you. Well, in this program, they're trying to mimic that in a sort of a served up fashion. So you get cognitive rehabilitation, computer based training. You participate in a support group, both for the patient. These are for people with mild cognitive impairment that will soon translate over into having Alzheimer's disease. And so there's a support group for the patients that they would meet together, and a support group for their caregivers that would meet together. There's wellness education, and there's also physical exercise. And this just describes these a little bit more, but if you take a quick look at it, these are very rigorous. Patient support groups will meet for an hour daily for the partner and the patient. Cognitive rehabilitation, memory training 5 days per week, 5 days a week for 2 weeks. And then go on from there. Computer brain training, complete an hour of brain training daily with the computer and maintain 250 minutes per week for 18 months. So there's a dosing issue too that's going on. Is there a point where brain training could go over the hump if you did enough of it? We don't know that yet. But you can see this is a very comprehensive kind of intervention where you're getting exposure and stimulation from a variety, and support actually, from a variety of different sources. Now, where do we go from here? Okay, what can we expect down the road a little bit? Well, there's some really cool stuff that's coming along. One is from brain imaging, and I mentioned the fact that some of the stuff is going on now. We're looking at people when they begin to start having unusual memory decline, that mild cognitive impairment that will likely change into Alzheimer's disease. And we're trying to interface in at that time and see if we can stop the disease. What we probably need to do is catch it as early before it even gets to that point to have some impact on it. And in Alzheimer's disease, beta amyloid and tau deposits are the two sort of classic pathological features that define Alzheimer's disease. And now we have markers that go in and identify those proteins in the brain, and we can use neuroimaging to see how much is in there. And so we can look at a healthy older adult and see, so a lot of hot colors, and this would be a lot of amyloid or a lot of tau, which would be signs of pathology. We can see that in a healthy individual, we don't have a lot of binding of those. And in someone with Alzheimer's disease, we see much higher levels of that binding. And if we can look at people early on and see they're beginning to reach some critical threshold in terms of developing amyloid plaques or tau, we may be able to go in with medications and stop that from developing. So brain imaging may give us a good leg up on identifying these diseases before they become clinical. This is pretty much the same thing, but it illustrates kind of the problem. Is that here's an older adult with low amyloid and tau. Here's a normal older adult, but they have pretty high levels. And then Alzheimer's patient, high levels, but a little bit higher. And it's really hard to know. These things do happen we do get deposits of amyloid and tau in individuals that don't have cognitive problems. So it doesn't always perfectly predict it, but it is a pretty important feature. This is pretty much the same sort of thing. Again, imaging in Alzheimer's disease, amyloid. Here's a normal amyloid negative. Here's a normal amyloid positive. And here's kind of the punchline. 30% of normal older people are amyloid positive. And so it doesn't necessarily take care of everything, but certainly the sooner we can catch these things and stop them from accelerating the degenerative processes of the brain, that could be helpful. Also want to put a plug in for cognitive testing and neuropsychology. I showed you this slide earlier before, where it was pretty clear looking at something like a memory test, a fluid kind of cognitive function, that we can identify this person based on their crystallized versus their fluid cognition at least 3 years prior to being diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. And for the same individual on a different test, this particular feature of this test, 4 years prior to their diagnosis, they've really bottomed out on it. And so cognitive testing can be a very powerful way of getting in there as well. And I do think that the future holds that we'll be advancing brain imaging techniques. So it's going to be very, very important for us. We're going to be advancing our sophistication in terms of cognitive testing, really working on both ends of the system to get a better picture. There are medications that are being tested right now that can stop the formation of tau and amyloid plaques. These have mostly been done in people who are already clinical, and the studies have been kind of lackluster so far. There's some more of these that we're looking at that may have to do, may do a little bit better. I want to just point out in this particular they say this is accompanied by a slowing of clinical decline measured by the clinical dementia rating, sum of boxes, and the mini mental state exam. Now, if any of you know what those tests are, if you don't, I'll just tell you that's like a stone tool to someone like myself in terms of cognitive function. So we need to take these critical tests looking at a drug that may reduce plaques. We need to do good behavioral work in those kinds of research as well, and that's something that we need to do a better job of. So again, behavioral approaches that we've talked about today, things to think about for healthy aging, non-neurological factors, lifestyle adjustments, exercise, diet, meditation, social engagement, mental stimulation, deal with those stereotypes of aging, brain training, maybe all the above. I'll skip that. Okay, so thank you.
Is this working now? Can you hear me? Okay, so everybody knows the format. We have a couple of people with mics who are going to be stationing themselves on different sides of the room. So we have some time for questions. Anyone have questions for Dr. Hall? Yes, Jeff.
Thank you for your presentations. Very, very interesting.
Thank you.
My mother is 99 years old, and when I visit her, or my siblings visit her, one of the activities she enjoys is remembering things. She can't remember what she did or encountered 3 days ago, but when looking through a photo album with her, I asked her who the 6 young girls were, and she said, those were my 8th grade classmates. That's so-and-so, so-and-so, so-and-so. She named them all off. What's up with that?
How many of you were nodding your head as he was telling that story? I saw a bunch of nodding heads across the audience. That is an extremely common type of memory loss that you see in advanced Alzheimer's disease. And the encoding of new material is what is particularly defective. And so new material is like, what did I have for breakfast today? That's new. And so that new material is not being encoded, and the neural substrates that allow that to happen are what's damaged. But those memories that are already in there, already represented in some sort of neural network, they sustain. And the time window gets smaller and smaller. They remember just a few years back, and then 10 years back, and only can remember 20 years back, until they can only remember their young adulthood or very early childhood or things like that. What's up with that, we don't know, except there is a difference between things that are being newly encoded in the brain and things that have been in there for a long, long time. And it seems that those very distant memories are the most sustaining of all. But that's an incredibly common thing. And I have a beautiful movie. It's called Complaints of a Dutiful Daughter, about Alzheimer's disease. If you ever get your hands on it, it's worth watching. But the daughter basically comes to the conclusion, it's like, who cares if she thinks I'm a girl from the sorority and we're talking about class? I'm just going to do that. And they sit there and they have a pleasant afternoon having that conversation. So we don't understand that entirely, but it's a very common kind of pattern of memory loss and memory recall.
Hi, is this on? Hi. From a younger perspective, so there's all this new technology, and we always use smartphones. You even see babies using iPads. So I'm wondering, what your predictions are for, I guess, the younger generations. Do you think our attention span is going to be shortened, or our memory?
Oh, I don't have to worry about that. I'll be long gone. You guys will just have to figure that one out with your iPads and phones and stuff. I don't know. I really don't know. I am not one of those people who feels like that iPads and cellular phones are the end of the world. I think it represents a shift in what we do as human beings. And it may shift the way that we process information and the way that our society functions, but I think these sort of neurological factors will be still at play. It's just that we may be able to augment them with those kinds of devices, or they may work a little differently in terms of our attention and things, but we're not going to change our brain overnight. And so if we do this for 10,000 years, then yeah, maybe something will happen. But in the short term, I just think it's just kind of a new wave that's what society is going to be like.
So we monitor blood pressure and cardiovascular disease and all this stuff. Should we be monitoring our brains somehow?
Well, I mean, in an ideal world, I think that sometime we reach young adulthood, we go in for our not annual, but our neuropsychological examination to set baseline on that. and we'd go in for a set of baseline brain scans that would be part of your medical profile, and then be able to look at that periodically over time. And so I think that would be a great thing down the future. But in terms of monitoring your brain status, other than that, there's not much you can do, except unless you feel like something isn't right. And that's when you either need to see a doctor, or you need to think about addressing some of the things that we've talked about tonight. Oh.
I missed the beginning of your talk, but did you
Well, that was the best part, too.
did you reference anything about like the placebo effect and memory loss if people think the medication is helping them?
Yeah, well, we touched a little bit on that. I mean, the placebo effect is really a powerful thing, and it's one of the most interesting things that's out there. And I've actually read some articles lately that said the placebo effect is getting bigger. And it has to do with our belief in medical model of treating disease. And so back, 50 years ago, if you said, here's a pill, you're like, oh, maybe it's, maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. Now we really believe that pill is going to work. And so it has an even more of an effect. There are definitely, placebo effects at work. The Prevagen study I talked about, where you have to compare that effect of that procedure, whether it's a nutritional supplement or a brain training program, against a placebo that's appropriate to see if that's really what's going on. I think placebo effects will be huge for these kinds of things. And so that's really an important part of doing the right kind of research to figure out what's going on here. I hope I answered your question.
It is worth $200 a week.
Maybe so.
I have a couple of questions.
Yes.
The first one is genes. I have a colleague, he says both my parents have dementia. I got long-term care insurance because I'm going to have dementia too. So do you know what the research can tell us about that?
Okay, go ahead.
Should I do can you remember two questions?
I doubt it. But I will ask you the second one again after you've asked me.
So second question is, how about work? You said social engagement is good, exercise helps with the brain. How about just plain out staying employed rather than retiring?
Yeah, that's a good point. I will attempt to remember that. What was your first question? No. The thing about genes in Alzheimer's disease is that if you have the genetic variant of Alzheimer's disease is extraordinarily rare. Extraordinarily rare. It's transmitted in autosomal dominant fashion. So if the parents have it, 50% of the offspring will have it. If you have that genetic variation of Alzheimer's disease that is definitely genetically transmitted, half of just about everybody in your family will have it. The onset is earlier. It's more like about age 55 or so, and the symptoms are much more severe. So it's the worst version of it that you can get. And so when I talk to my classes, I say, don't worry about if your grandmother or somebody in your family or even a couple have had dementia. If you have the genetically transmitted form, you will know it. At least half of the people in your family will have dementia. Now, if that's the case, you can get genetic testing. You can find that out if you want to, and so forth. But for the most part, almost the vast majority of cases are just idiosyncratic. We don't know where they come from. They just pop up. And so we don't know what causes that yet. So the genetics is there. There's lots of genetic information about Alzheimer's disease. Beta amyloid, those amyloid plaques, we know the genetic loci for that contributes to those kind of deposits. But I could name you about 5 or 6 different genetic components that seem to be at play but aren't sufficient to cause Alzheimer's disease. So there needs to be something else that goes along with some of those. The most reliable one is apolipoprotein 4. It's different alleles of a gene, apolipoprotein. And if you have the version 4, you have a much higher chance of converting over into Alzheimer's disease. I can't remember the exact percentage, but it's not 100%, but it's a higher percent. So there are some genetic factors at play. And there's the inherited version of Alzheimer's disease. There are other genetic factors that seem to be at play for idiopathic Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease. And then, but then we don't know exactly how that's working. We don't even know if amyloid is a problem yet or not. They've taken some of these human studies with those drugs I was mentioning. They've been able to reduce amyloid, but aren't able to improve them clinically. So it's still, jury's still out on that. Question about work. Okay. In terms of work, I think that that's an engaging type of activity as well. I think it really depends on what people's attitudes are about work and attitudes are about retirement, how any given individual are going to respond to that. If retirement is a signal of throwing the towel in and sitting on the porch in a rocking chair and not doing anything, then retirement is probably not good for you. If work's a place where you get your engagement and social stimulation and mental stimulation, then working will be good for you. Maybe that you would need to, at some point, change jobs to be in a situation that's more useful to you. But I think that's a very individual kind of situation in which work would need to be addressing the kind of things that we were talking about tonight.
Stuart, right here.
Yeah.
Retire and come to the Molly classes.
Great advice, great advice. Okay, who has more advice or questions? Anybody? Okay, back here in the back and then down to you.
I'm just curious about if there's a reason for this. I notice in my own family, my brother, I think he's got a pretty similar brain to mine, except it might be quicker. He can remember everything from long, long ago, and I can remember it. If he reminds me, then I can get there, but I have no idea. They don't bump into those memories, but his seem to be close to the surface. Do you know a reason for that?
No, not really. Yeah, next question. We do know that recognition memory is easier than free recall. So if I said, here's a list of 10 words I want you to remember, and then I just said, what are those 10 words? That's free recall. That's harder to do. If I said, here's a list of 20 words, and in there those 10 words are embedded, you can do that a lot better. And so what's happening with your brother is he's giving you a cue or a prompt that allows you to access one of your memories. And that's very common. It facilitates memory performance. It's a type of intervention you would use if somebody has a memory deficit. It's trying to help them use cueing and prompts to help that. Why they come automatically to him, I don't know. It may be that they're more salient to him or has some other quality about them that makes them come up. Maybe you can catch him one day by thinking of a few things he hadn't thought of and get back at him. So I don't know about that kind of stuff. That's hard to say, but I'm not surprised that you have that experience of him saying, do you remember this? And that triggers you and you go, oh yeah, I do. I haven't thought about that in ages. And that's a very common experience. Lots of people have that. So I don't know if I could help you any more than that. Mm-hmm.
Stuart, that was really an interesting talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
But one of the situations I think they're finding is an important contributor to Alzheimer's also is pollution.
Mm-hmm.
That in individuals who are exposed or who have the ApoE4 mutation, there's a 40% increased risk if you live in an area with high air pollution. And so a lot of times we're seeing in areas like Mexico City, the increase in Alzheimer's is alarming.
Yeah.
And as air quality becomes worse and worse in a lot of developing nations, in large parts of India, large parts of China, and certainly parts of the United States and London, as they're going to more diesel fuel, they're starting to see an alarming increase of Alzheimer's associated with that air pollution.
Thank you. Was everybody able to hear that question? She was just making the point that that another factor that's really come up on the radar is air pollution, like in Mexico City and other places like that where you have really significant air pollution, that the incidence rates of Alzheimer's disease is skyrocketing in those places. So that would be another environmental factor that's a huge risk factor. We actually have a researcher here on campus that studies that. So another reason to support the neurosciences here. But that's right. This is certainly not meant to be an exhaustive list. I appreciate that point. That's a very good one, and I'm sure there's some that I left out as well. In fact, I know there are. So a few I skipped over. Because some of these relationships, with medical research, it kind of drive you crazy sometimes, like, garlic's good, garlic's bad. Butter's good, butter's bad. What the heck is going on? And it's when you take the body and all the variables of our physiology and you're just finding relationships. You're finding correlations. They're not causal relationships. They may mean something, they may not. But with all the variables we have that dictate our physiology and our health, you can correlate almost anything with it. I had some stuff that I kicked out of this talk I used to use in some of my old talks. I have newspaper articles like, newsflash, head size correlates with Alzheimer's disease. And so if you had a small head, your chance of getting Alzheimer's disease was greater. Had another one, use of electric power tools puts you at risk for Alzheimer's disease. This has been going on for the 30 years I've been in the business. Every day you get up, you turn on the radio, electric tools related to Alzheimer's. Oh God, it's going to be a bad day at work. And you go in there and you hear all this stuff. So these correlational things are useful to know, but they don't always add up to something. But there's a lot of things like that, air pollution and other kinds of toxic exposures that obviously it's not hard to figure out how that would be a causal factor.
One more question, maybe.
You've used two terms that I am totally unfamiliar with, and that's amyloid and tau.
And that's why I get paid the big money.
And then I have one other thing. I'd like you to tell me what they are, but I listened to a group of Alzheimer's experts a number of years ago speaking to a large group, and of course they encouraged everybody to eat more fresh fruits and vegetables, get more exercise, play more Sudoku and crossword puzzles, and have 14 1/4 cups of red wine per week.
Not per day, okay.
Not per day.
I'll be glad to try and answer your question. First of all, I did mention, I believe somewhere, moderate alcohol usage. That's my favorite one. So that there has been a link to some of the byproducts, especially of wine, that are in wine. And so that's been known for a while, that can be a protective factor. The technical terms I used, amyloid and plaque, or amyloid and tau, there are two things that can make the definitive diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. And up until only recently with the neuroimaging, the only way you could do that is at autopsy, because they're microscopic findings. So you have to go inside the brain, look at a slice of the brain tissue under microscope, and you'll see these little microscopic changes, and a beta amyloid plaque looks like what it sounds like, a big glob of protein there in the brain. And those form up in more and more, or in greater and greater numbers as we age, and then you go into Alzheimer's disease, they super accelerate in their number. We don't know, it's sort of the chicken or egg question right now, we don't know if amyloid causes Alzheimer's disease by plugging up neurons, or whether it's a after effect, that the neurons die and leave the amyloid. But we're working on that now that we have medications that can lower amyloid, and we can look at amyloid levels in humans with scanners and see what's going on with them while they're still alive. We may learn more about that in the very near future. But amyloid is one of those microscopic changes that's characteristic of Alzheimer's disease. The other characteristic neuropathology of Alzheimer's disease is what we call tangles, or neurofibrillary tangles, if you feel like another big word. But those are really internal structures of a neuron, sort of like tubes that run inside the neuron, that begin to sort of unfold. And when they do, they're held together by tau. And tau will become sort of released into the brain. And you can, and so that's the other classic marker for the pathology that's characteristic of Alzheimer's disease. And so if you look at a study where they're studying Alzheimer's patients, they will refer to them as dementia of the Alzheimer's type or probable Alzheimer's patients, because the only definitive diagnosis is at autopsy. Does that make sense to you? Yes. Okay, good. The other thing, just another fun fact, is that tau deposits are what you see like crazy in the brains of people that have CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, the pathology that happens from repetitive blows to the head, such as in football players. That's what you're seeing in those folks is tau deposits. And I have some slides of that from some of the NFL brain bank that would surprise you, but it can be very extensive.
Okay, Professor Hall, thanks. I think it's about 8:30. Let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you.
And come on down and ask questions if you have more things to talk about. Okay, thanks a lot. See you next week.